The air in Montecito was different that morning, not because of the heavy ocean mist that clung to the California coastline or the scent of manicured roses wafting from behind estate gates. No, it was something else. A silence, a tension, as if every home, every camera, every eye was waiting for the same thing. And they were. At exactly 9 a.m. Pacific time, the official website of the British monarchy quietly updated its page on royal titles. The Duke of Sussex was no longer listed. No reference to honorary military roles, no symbolic ties to regimental heritage, no patronages or duties. Just a name. Prince Harry, stripped bare of everything but blood. But it wasn't just what was taken away that shook the world. It was who received it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In a move no one predicted, King Charles bestowed the vacant honors, every last one of them. Not upon his eldest son, Prince William, not upon any noble within the aristocratic ranks, but upon a man the world barely knew, Sir Timothy Lawrence. And in doing so, he ignited a royal explosion whose flames would engulf Montecito, London, and every corner of the globe where monarchy still matters. But how did it come to this? How did the youngest son of a beloved princess, once called the People's Prince, fall so far from the throne that his father replaced him with a former naval officer married to the Queen's daughter? How did a father who once seemed too passive to act, too slow to judge, suddenly summon the force of centuries-old tradition and law to deliver what felt, to some, like a personal reckoning? To answer that, we must go back, not just to the day the palace pulled the trigger, but to the many quiet years leading up to this moment, years marked by whispers, warnings, and wounds never allowed to heal. And then we must journey forward, through the shockwaves that followed. Meghan's reported meltdown, Harry's ghost-like silence, William's icy refusal to comment, and a divided public struggling to decide, was this justice? Or was this vengeance dressed in royal robes? The story you're about to witness isn't just about titles. It's about the death of illusion. It's about what happens when family becomes theater, when legacy clashes with freedom, and when a king decides that love for crown must outweigh love for blood. It is a story of betrayal, power, consequences, and a new kind of monarchy born not in Buckingham Palace, but in defiance of its most rebellious son. It begins not with a coronation, but with a silence, the kind that blankets Montecito before a storm. Imagine the early hours at the Sussex estate. The blinds drawn tightly, the phones buzzing constantly. Inside, Meghan Markle. Former actress, former duchess, mother of two, and arguably one of the most polarizing women in modern royal history, walks back and forth in the living room of their multi-million-dollar mansion. She is reportedly pacing, phone in hand, pausing only to glance at the television screen where British broadcasters are losing their collective minds. Her face is pale, her eyes hard. The palace hasn't called. There was no warning, no heads up, just a headline. King Charles strips Prince Harry of all remaining titles. Sir Timothy Lawrence named successor. The news hits harder than any media scandal, harder than the Oprah interview fallout, harder than the Netflix backlash. Because this time, it isn't a tabloid. It's the monarchy itself. The institution Harry was born into, the one that protected him, criticized him, defined him, has made its final judgment. And it has spoken with silence, action, and an unmistakable message. You are no longer one of us. And what about Harry? Witnesses say he left their Montecito home just after dawn, alone, dressed in civilian clothes and a baseball cap pulled low. He was seen entering what looked like a private wellness clinic, the same one he's reportedly visited during previous crises. But this time, there were no statements, no Instagram posts, no sources close to the Duke offering spin, just absence. Quiet. The kind of quiet that speaks louder than any press release. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another man was preparing for a very different morning. Sir Timothy Lawrence, former Vice Admiral in the Royal Navy, husband to Princess and now the newly appointed custodian of multiple royal duties once held by the Duke of Sussex, was spotted arriving at St. James's Palace. No entourage, no flashy clothing, no emotion, only a folder tucked beneath his arm and a salute exchanged with palace guards. This was a man who had served quietly for decades. a man who never sought the spotlight but had suddenly become its center. And yet, his name was not unfamiliar to those paying attention. Sir Timothy had long been a trusted confidant of the Queen. His marriage to Princess and the no-nonsense daughter of Queen Elizabeth II placed him within the inner circle of royal stability. Unlike Harry, whose every decision seemed to provoke crisis, Sir Timothy represented the calm after the storm. He was the anti-Harry, loyal, consistent, discreet, and devoutly patriotic. Insiders whisper that King Charles had been considering this shift for months, that in meetings closed to the press and off the record, the monarch had expressed grave concern over the public image of the monarchy, particularly among younger generations. The Netflix deal, the podcast drama, the memoir, these weren't just bad PR. They were, to some in the palace, acts of rebellion against the institution itself. And Charles, whose reign had begun with promises of modernization and unity, was now faced with a choice: to forgive and forget, or to preserve and protect. He chose the latter. And he didn't just do it quietly. He did it symbolically, publicly, completely, with a series of royal edicts filed behind closed doors and made visible to the world with just a few digital keystrokes. King Charles did what no monarch had done in centuries. He erased his own son from the official royal order. But this wasn't exile. It wasn't revenge. Not officially. The wording was cold, measured, bureaucratic. In accordance with the Crown's responsibility to assign royal roles to those best positioned to uphold its values, His Majesty the King has approved the reassignment of titles and duties previously held by the Duke of Sussex to Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Lawrence, KCB, ADC. And yet, for those watching, the message couldn't have been clearer. Harry is out. Timothy is in. The response was immediate. Journalists flooded Montecito. British talk shows broke into special coverage. In Parliament, members of both major parties commented on the significance of the move. And online, the reactions ranged from glee to outrage. Supporters of the royal family cheered. Finally, Charles is acting like a king. Others, especially fans of Harry and Meghan, condemned it as a cold-hearted act of betrayal. And somewhere in the middle, many simply asked, why now? Why did Charles wait until now to pull the trigger? Why appoint Timothy instead of William? And what does this mean for the future of the monarchy? These are the questions we'll be exploring in the chapters ahead. Through secret meetings, private recordings, old wounds, and new alliances, we'll uncover the full scope of what really happened behind palace walls. You'll hear what royal insiders told us. You'll learn how this decision may have been shaped by more than duty, possibly by deep, personal pain. And you'll see how one man's quiet loyalty became more powerful than another's fame. Because this isn't just the story of a title transfer. This is the story of a royal reckoning. A moment when a family, a nation, and a crown collided in a single, irreversible choice. And at the heart of it all, a son disowned, a father unflinching, and a new knight rising into history's spotlight. Now the world watches. And so do we. The story of Sir Timothy Lawrence is not one of headlines or viral clips. There were no scandals bearing his name, no best-selling memoirs with confessional chapters, no podcast episodes peeling back layers of trauma. In fact, until the crown rested unseen on his shoulder, few in the public had even bothered to look twice at the man who would come to embody a quiet but potent force in the royal family. That's what made him so dangerous to those who craved attention. And so attractive to a king who had seen too many of his family's private wounds made into tabloid spectacles. It began, fittingly, with silence. Timothy Lawrence was born into a modest, middle-class family in South London in 1955. His father, Commander Guy Lawrence, was a decorated officer in the Royal Navy, a man who believed in duty above glory and in restraint over showmanship. His mother, Barbara, was a homemaker and community volunteer, known in their neighborhood for her humility and sense of order. From the outset, Timothy grew up under the shadow of national service. Not the expectation of celebrity, but the call of responsibility. While the world's attention leaned toward the aristocracy and the flamboyant heirs to palatial estates, the Lawrences cultivated a different kind of prestige, one built on discretion and contribution. Educated at the prestigious New Beacon School and then at Sevenoaks, Timothy's early academic life was marked not by dramatic achievements, but by solid discipline. He wasn't the class clown or the standout genius. He was the one teachers could trust, the student who submitted work quietly and on time. In the years that followed, he would go on to attend University College, Durham, where he studied geography. Not politics, not drama. Geography, the science of understanding the world, its edges, and how its borders shift over time. A fitting metaphor, perhaps, for a man who would later stand on the ever-changing edge of royalty. But it wasn't academia that would define him. It was the sea. Timothy followed in his father's footsteps and joined the Royal Navy in 1973, just shy of his 18th birthday. What began as a conventional career in maritime service quickly evolved into something deeper, more complex. Rising through the ranks with steady diligence, Lawrence was known for his ability to lead without spectacle. Colleagues described him as composed, meticulous, a man of few words but precise actions. He didn't dominate meetings, he resolved them. He didn't bask in attention, he diverted it to others. It was in 1986, during his time as an equerry, a senior attendant and advisor, to Queen Elizabeth II, that Timothy first entered the periphery of public curiosity. A tall, clean-cut naval officer with impeccable manners, he was often seen walking a few respectful paces behind the Queen, holding open doors, assisting with itineraries, coordinating logistics. To the untrained eye, he was just another faceless aide in uniform. But to those within the palace walls, Timothy was quickly becoming known as the one person who could soothe tempers, keep secrets, and solve problems without creating new ones. By 1989, the world would come to know his name, but not because he sought recognition. In what became one of the more scandalous but understated royal stories of the late 20th century, it was revealed that Timothy Lawrence had developed a deep and personal connection with Princess and the Queen's only daughter. At the time, and was still married to Captain Mark Phillips, but their relationship was unraveling. What began as professional respect between the princess and the naval officer quietly evolved into mutual admiration and eventually affection. When private letters from Timothy to and were leaked to the press, never confirmed by the palace, but widely believed to be authentic, the media frenzy was immediate. But unlike the hysteria that would later surround Harry and Meghan, the narrative was brief and the coverage cautious. There was no sit-down interview, no tearful explanations. Timothy retreated from public view, issued no statements, and continued his naval duties without distraction. When Anne and her husband divorced, and she eventually married Timothy in a small ceremony in Scotland in 1992, it was done without fanfare. No grand wedding, no designer gowns, no fireworks, just two people who understood the weight of public life and chose, instead, to step around the spotlight. And that, in many ways, became the defining pattern of Timothy Lawrence's existence: proximity to power without the thirst for it. Over the next 3 decades, Anne carried out one of the highest numbers of public engagements of any royal and often served as the monarchy's most hard-working and least controversial figure. Timothy stood at her side. Quiet, consistent, and effective. His military career continued, reaching the rank of vice admiral before his retirement. He advised the Ministry of Defense. He led initiatives in marine conservation. He worked on housing strategies for veterans. Yet he never once courted media coverage, and until the recent events, never granted an in-depth interview. Inside royal circles, however, his influence grew. Staff at Buckingham and St. James's palaces began to refer to him in hushed tones as a problem solver. When international dignitaries visited and delicate protocols were involved, it was often Timothy who quietly ensured all ran smoothly. When friction rose among younger royals, particularly in the years when Harry and Meghan began to voice their grievances with the institution, Timothy's name often surfaced in discussions not as a player, but as a stabilizer, a private advisor, a calming counterpoint to the chaos erupting from across the Atlantic. It wasn't long before King Charles began to rely on him more directly. Sources close to the palace suggest that in the months leading up to the Queen's death, as Charles prepared to assume the throne, he began holding informal strategy meetings not only with aides and ministers, but also with personal confidants. Among them was Sir Timothy, whose reputation for discretion and clarity had become invaluable. What was discussed in those meetings remains unknown. But what's clear is that Charles, a monarch often accused of indecision and compromise, was beginning to realize that the future of the crown could not be secured through sentiment. He needed allies who didn't just understand tradition but respected its purpose, not as a cage, but as a structure. In Timothy, he saw the embodiment of that philosophy. This shift didn't happen overnight. For years, there had been mounting frustration within the institution over Harry's actions. The memoir, the interviews, the lawsuits against the British press. Each step was viewed by the firm as a fracture. Not because of their content necessarily, but because of what they represented, a rejection of unity. A preference for personal narrative over collective legacy. Where Harry sought to correct the past, Timothy worked to preserve the future. And it was this dichotomy that ultimately shaped Charles's decision. But the public never saw it coming. When the palace announcement dropped, many assumed it would be a ceremonial reassignment, that perhaps a noble with no real duties would be named to hold the roles temporarily. No one predicted that the king would elevate someone so close to him personally, someone so quietly embedded in the royal machine, and someone so far removed from the public's imagination of what a royal replacement should be. Yet for those inside the monarchy, the move made perfect sense. Sir Timothy Lawrence wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a gossip headline. He was, above all, a functionary of stability. And in a world where monarchy teetered between relevance and spectacle, that counted for everything. Still, the public's reaction was split. Some hailed it as a masterstroke. Finally, someone deserving of honor. Others saw it as a betrayal. How could Charles do this to his own son? And then there were those who simply asked, who is this man, and why does he matter? This chapter answers that question. Sir Timothy Lawrence matters because he represents the crown's return to substance over style, to service over spectacle, to discipline over drama. He may not have given interviews or written books or starred in documentaries, but he stood, for decades, through crises, through transitions, through the noise. And when the time came, the king looked not to the loudest voice in the room, but to the quietest, and handed him the keys. The rise of Sir Timothy was not the rise of a new prince, but the restoration of an old principle. That the monarchy, for all its flaws, must be grounded not in who shouts the loudest, but in who listens the longest. And so, while the cameras swarm outside Montecito and the headlines swirl with shock, the man at the center of it all walks through the palace halls in silence. Not out of fear, but out of purpose. He has nothing to prove. He already served. And now, he reigns, not as a king, but as the one who was chosen when the king needed a loyal heart. To understand the moment King Charles made the decision to strip Prince Harry of his remaining titles, one must not look at it as a single event, but rather as the culmination of years of mounting frustration, emotional strain, and a slow, painful unraveling of trust. The House of Windsor had long operated under the unwritten rule of never complain, never explain, but in the new age of streaming, social media, and 24-hour opinion cycles, that rule began to rot from within. What had once been the firm's strongest weapon, silence, was now viewed by some as a sign of guilt, even complicity. And at the center of that moral conundrum stood Prince Harry and his wife, Meghan Markle, proclaiming their truth from outside the palace gates. In the eyes of the world, the breaking point appeared to be gradual. But inside the palace, sources say the final straw snapped with a deafening silence. And not from the Duke, but from the King himself. It didn't start with the Netflix documentary, though it rattled Buckingham's foundations. Nor was it Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey alone, though the palace had scrambled for days afterward trying to figure out how to respond to allegations of racism and neglect. It wasn't even the publication of Harry's memoir, a literary juggernaut of emotional trauma, betrayal, and personal exposure that threw members of the royal family under a global microscope. No, it was what came after all of that. When Harry and Meghan began pitching new entertainment ventures, openly seeking to commercialize their royal experiences, it sent a shiver through every ancestral hall the Windsors occupied. Even the Queen, in her final years, had issued carefully worded statements expressing support for their personal growth, while remaining deeply loved members of the family. But there was always an unspoken hope that eventually they would quiet down, that the storm would pass, that blood would prove thicker than ratings. It didn't. By 2023, The Sussexes were no longer ex-royals living in quiet exile. They were influencers, brand ambassadors, celebrity commentators. Their foundation had expanded into lifestyle products. Meghan was reportedly shopping around a memoir of her own. Meetings with major Hollywood studios, fashion executives, and media conglomerates became regular events. A podcast empire was being floated. And through all of it, the palace watched in silent horror as the institution they worked to preserve became a commodity in the hands of those who walked away from it. The idea that royalty could be rebranded for the American market was once laughable. But here it was, playing out in real time. Harry and Meghan weren't just telling their story, they were monetizing it. And while that may have been a perfectly acceptable path for celebrities and influencers, it was an existential threat to the monarchy. Because the crown doesn't survive on popularity, it survives on sanctity, on mystique, on the idea that it is something beyond reach. And Harry had made it a product, one click away on your phone. That was the betrayal. According to multiple senior sources within the royal household, the conversation that triggered King Charles's final decision came during a private lunch at Highgrove, the king's cherished country residence in Gloucestershire. There were no cameras, no media leaks, just a fire roaring in the background, a decanter of scotch between two men, and a printed copy of an internal report on the Sussexes' latest business dealings. The report had been prepared by a team of advisors tasked with monitoring the reputational risk posed by Harry and Meghan's ongoing ventures. One entry allegedly stood out more than the others. It referenced a confidential meeting Meghan had with a top-tier Hollywood development executive. The pitch? A semi-fictional streaming series loosely inspired by her royal experience, framed as The Crown from the inside. According to a source close to the situation, the proposal was vague enough to avoid legal trouble, but close enough to be interpreted as yet another direct assault on the institution. King Charles reportedly stared at the page in silence for a long while. Then, he closed the folder and whispered something that, to the aide present, felt like a verdict rather than a comment. He's made his choice. What followed was a tightly controlled operation orchestrated with precision that only royalty can manage. Behind closed doors, legal advisors began reviewing the protocols for reassigning honorary military titles and symbolic appointments. While most of Harry's formal responsibilities had been suspended following the Sussexes' exit from working royal life, there were still ceremonial connections that lingered, symbols of a past the palace had hoped to salvage. Those symbols were now liabilities. The public had started to notice the contradiction. Harry, on one hand, still retained certain honorary references. He was still associated with the Invictus Games, a project the palace deeply respected. He still used certain royal stylings, particularly in public-facing media. And while his HRH title was not formally rescinded, it was understood that he no longer used it in any official capacity. But to the average British citizen, especially those loyal to the monarchy, it was confusing. How could someone so clearly outside the institution still be tethered to its dignity? This question began surfacing in the press. Conservative columnists called for clarity. Royalists on social media demanded action. Even some younger voices, typically more sympathetic to Harry and Meghan, began questioning the couple's strategy. Were they fighting for freedom or leveraging the system they claimed to reject? King Charles, a man historically accused of indecision, was now being forced to decide. And so he did. The decision was made official not with fanfare, but with signatures. A formal document was prepared under the sovereign grant, outlining the reassignment of all honorary military affiliations and royal duties previously linked to the Duke of Sussex. The language was cold, administrative, devoid of emotion, but the implications were volcanic. To the public, the announcement came via the official royal website. 1 minute the page existed with the usual titles. The next, it was updated. Gone. Replaced. It was as if Harry had vanished from the royal record. At least the working one. But then came the shockwave, the new appointee, Sir Timothy Lawrence. If the stripping of Harry's titles was the match, naming Timothy was the firestorm. By choosing Timothy, King Charles didn't just make a personnel decision. He made a statement. He elevated loyalty over blood, stability over emotion, service over spectacle. And perhaps most painfully for Harry, he chose another man to fill a space once reserved for a son. It wasn't an accident. Sources within the palace suggest that Charles had grown increasingly fond of Sir Timothy in recent years, not just because of his record or his marriage to Princess Anne, but because of his temperament. Calm, measured, disciplined. In private meetings, Timothy had reportedly been one of the few voices to urge patience during the height of the Sussex drama. While others in the royal family had wanted immediate retaliation after the Oprah interview, Timothy had reportedly advised Charles to let the storm pass. He had, until now, always advocated for reconciliation, but even he had limits. When asked privately, days before his appointment, whether he would accept the titles, Timothy is said to have hesitated. Only if it helps the crown, he allegedly responded. It was a quiet answer, and that's precisely why Charles approved him. Meanwhile, the mood in Montecito darkened. Reports from inside the Sussex camp described a sense of betrayal, not just because of the loss of titles that had been expected in some form, but because of who replaced Harry. Sir Timothy's appointment wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. It was a reminder that the monarchy was willing to move on, that the institution didn't need Harry's charisma, that the vacuum he created could be filled, and filled well, by someone who had never sought the spotlight in the first place. For Meghan, the reaction was reportedly visceral. One source described her as incandescent. Another said she was shocked by the coldness of the move. There were immediate conversations with their legal team, whether or not to issue a statement, whether to fight it, whether to speak again. Harry, however, was said to be silent. Those close to him described him as deeply hurt but unsurprised. He had long sensed that the palace was moving away from him, but it was the finality of the gesture, the cleanliness of the cut, that left him reeling. For years, he had lived in the liminal space between royal and renegade. Now, there was no ambiguity. He was out, and someone else had taken his place. What made it worse was the lack of communication. No call from Charles. No warning. Just the update. Just the news. Just the world watching as it happened. In the weeks that followed, the story became a cultural flashpoint. Debates raged across television panels, podcasts, and social media platforms. Was Charles right to act? Had Harry gone too far? Was this the monarchy evolving, or a father exacting emotional revenge? As one commentator put it, the House of Windsor may be ancient, but its wounds are very modern. What remains clear is this: the final straw was not one thing, but everything. A pattern, a tension, a choice. And now, the monarchy has made its move. Harry is no longer a prince in any practical sense. Meghan is no longer a duchess in any operational way. The page has turned, and standing in their place is a man who never sought to be part of the story, but who now finds himself carrying its next chapter. The announcement may have reached the public with the cold efficiency of a digital update, but what happened before that, deep within the regal corridors of the monarchy, was anything but ordinary. The decision to transfer Prince Harry's remaining titles and roles was historic in its own right. But what elevated the event from royal reshuffle to cultural earthquake was how the transition was sealed. In a secret ceremony shrouded in tradition, stripped of fanfare, and utterly invisible to the eyes of the press. It took place behind the fortified gates of Balmoral Castle, the beloved Scottish estate where monarchs have historically found sanctuary from the glare of London. It's a place known less for political pomp and more for personal reflection. But on that cold morning, Balmoral became the epicenter of a calculated power move. Only a handful of individuals were aware of what was unfolding. The planning had begun weeks in advance, disguised beneath other royal engagements and coded travel logs. Those summoned were given minimal notice and even less instruction. Senior aides were instructed to maintain complete silence. No press briefings. No internal leaks. Every piece of communication was delivered in person, face-to-face. The kind of secrecy that hadn't been seen since the days of wartime briefings. Inside Balmoral's grand drawing room, a space adorned with oil portraits, mahogany detail, and ancestral presence. The preparations were austere but symbolic. The royal standard flew overhead. A handful of ceremonial items were laid out with precision: a red leather document box containing the royal decree, a metal case with military insignia, and a replica of the regalia once associated with the honorary titles now vacated by Prince Harry. There were no photographers, no media crews, and no crowd waiting outside the castle gates. Only silence. The monarchy was reclaiming its narrative in the shadows. At precisely 11 a.m., King Charles entered the chamber, dressed not in full ceremonial robes, but in a dark tailored suit bearing the subtle embroidery of the Order of the Garter. His expression was grave, not angry, not triumphant, but steeped in the weight of consequence. He was accompanied by two of his most trusted advisors and the palace's chief herald, the official responsible for managing matters of titles and lineage. Then came Sir Timothy Lawrence, dressed in the understated navy of a retired vice-admiral, with medals pinned to his chest and posture as straight as ever. He entered the room with the quiet discipline of a man who knew what this moment meant, not just for himself, but for the institution he had served for decades. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply stepped forward, eyes level, ready to accept what had once been the province of a prince. What transpired next was part ritual, part declaration. King Charles, holding the royal decree, read aloud the language that would formally transfer the titles. Every word had been chosen with precision, crafted by palace legal teams and reviewed by constitutional scholars. The decree referenced the Crown's obligation to uphold the dignity of service and the need to place royal responsibilities in the hands of those committed to the enduring legacy of duty. No names were mentioned beyond Sir Timothy's. It was a ghosting of the most official kind. Once the reading concluded, Sir Timothy was presented with three emblems: a ceremonial medallion representing the Royal Marines, a sash denoting his new patronage over the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, and a simple gold insignia, the very one Prince Harry had worn during his final trooping the color before stepping down from royal duties. The symbolism was chillingly deliberate. The final act of the ceremony was a nod to tradition. In a rare gesture reserved for moments of significant royal transition, King Charles placed his hand on Sir Timothy's shoulder and spoke words only those in the room would hear. 8 accounts suggest the king said something along the lines of, "You've already served. Now, you represent." Whether that quote is accurate or apocryphal, the sentiment behind it was unmistakable. Sir Timothy, without theatrics, gave a short, solemn reply. Then the decree was signed, sealed, and locked back into the red box. And just like that, it was done. No trumpet sounded. No portrait unveiled. Yet, at that very moment, the monarchy shifted. The days following the ceremony remained tightly controlled. Balmoral staff were instructed not to discuss the event. Even members of the extended royal family were kept in the dark until hours before the public announcement. Princess Anne, Timothy's wife, was reportedly informed beforehand, not because of protocol, but because of practicality. She would now share her home and responsibilities with a man elevated to one of the highest ceremonial positions in the royal structure. Her reaction, by most accounts, was neither surprised nor ecstatic, just accepting, as she is known to be. But word does not stay silent in royal circles for long. Whispers began to travel through corridors in Clarence House and Sandringham. A security contractor was overheard referencing unusual protocol changes at Balmoral. A local bakery in Scotland, responsible for delivering goods to the estate, noted a sudden uptick in discreet staff arrivals and heavy confidentiality clauses. The palace, usually adept at avoiding leaks, was playing defense now. And still, the press didn't catch wind of it. Not until days later, when a single photograph surfaced online. It was taken by a hiker passing through the Cairngorms near Balmoral, who caught a long-range image of what appeared to be a convoy of blacked-out Range Rovers making their way down the estate's private road. The timing and positioning matched perfectly with the internal calendar estimates. Within hours, the photo went viral. Headlines speculated wildly. Was it a health emergency? A royal summit? A covert family meeting? No one guessed the truth, that a prince's final ties had been cut. When the public announcement finally came, it landed like a thunderclap. The statement was published in terse, formal language across royal channels, reading more like a notice of office restructuring than the reordering of family legacy. But within minutes, it was global news. Networks interrupted their broadcasts. Social media descended into a frenzy. Royal watchers who'd studied family dynamics for decades admitted they had not seen this coming. Because if there's one thing the monarchy excels at, when it chooses to, it is secrecy. And in this case, the secrecy was the point. By keeping the ceremony private, the palace avoided spectacle. There would be no images of Harry's crest being physically removed, no dramatic scenes of titles being revoked in a courtroom-like setting. There would be no confrontation, only finality, quiet, clean, and irreversible. But make no mistake, the drama was real. Inside Montecito, the reaction to the ceremony, once it became known, was explosive. A former staff member familiar with the Sussex household claimed that Meghan was blindsided and furious, while Harry reportedly refused to comment even in private. The symbolism cut deep. It wasn't just about losing titles. It was about seeing them physically transferred to someone else. Someone Harry knew. Someone who had been in the room during family gatherings. Someone who had never once tried to compete, and yet, now, was wearing the badge of approval Harry had been stripped of. To some, this move marked a brutal turning point. There would be no path back. Whatever private hopes may have lingered for reconciliation, even after Oprah, even after Spare, even after the Spotify fallout, had evaporated in a room inside Balmoral, far from cameras, far from forgiveness. King Charles had made his choice, and in doing so, he had reasserted an ancient truth about monarchy. That family comes second to the crown. That bloodline, while sacred, is not immune to judgment, and that those who abandon the throne's responsibilities may find their place replaced by those who never sought it. For Sir Timothy, the aftermath was quiet. He returned to his duties with no statement, no interview, no public appearance. When asked about the appointment weeks later during a veterans fundraiser, he replied only, "My role is to serve where I'm asked." And then he changed the subject. The ceremony at Balmoral may never be replayed in footage or photos, but its impact will echo through royal history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was decisive. It marked a new era not just of royal appointments, but of royal discipline. A line was drawn, not in blood, but in duty, and those who crossed it, even those born to rule, now stand on the outside, watching others step into their place. In that quiet Scottish castle, behind a locked door, under centuries-old portraits, a modern monarchy found its steel. And the world, finally, understood just how far it was willing to go to protect itself. The luxury enclave of Montecito, California, had always been synonymous with tranquility, privacy, and prestige. Tucked away behind bougainvillea-covered gates, its rolling hills were home to a who's who of Hollywood elites, business magnates, and entertainment royalty. Yet, on that particular day, the day the world learned Prince Harry had been stripped of his remaining titles and Sir Timothy Lawrence had been elevated in his place, the usually hushed serenity of Montecito shattered like a pane of glass under pressure. The first signs of the unfolding storm weren't public. They started privately, inside the palatial Sussex estate, a sprawling, $14.7 million property equipped with tennis courts, rose gardens, and an avocado orchard. But all the luxury in the world couldn't shield its occupants from what had just been broadcast across every major network from London to Los Angeles. Sources close to the family described the atmosphere inside the house that day as tense, volatile, and eerily quiet. Meghan Markle, usually the public voice of the Sussex brand, was reportedly the first to react. A member of their staff, speaking under strict anonymity, said that as soon as the news alert popped up on Meghan's phone, she gasped audibly and dropped it onto the couch. The headlines were brutal. King Charles erases Prince Harry. Sir Timothy replaces Harry as royal representative. Duke no more. Harry's final link to monarchy severed. Within minutes, the calls began. Meghan was pacing in the living room, phone pressed tightly to her ear, speaking with a publicist, then a lawyer, then someone from Netflix. There was no plan in place for this kind of event. No media response template, no pre-written statement. They had been blindsided. The palace had said nothing in advance. Not a word, not a warning. It was, in every sense, an ambush. Harry, on the other hand, was harder to read. According to a longtime friend of the prince, he had become accustomed to surprises from the palace. But this was different. He reportedly stood at the window in silence for nearly an hour after learning the news. Just stood there, watching the Montecito horizon, the Pacific Ocean shimmering in the distance, unmoving. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. But those close to him said his stillness was more unsettling than any outburst. It was the silence of a man who had just lost something he thought could never truly be taken. It wasn't about the titles, not entirely. It was about finality. Up until that moment, despite the public fights and the press drama and the explosive interviews, Harry had maintained a quiet, personal hope that someday, perhaps years from now, reconciliation would come, that his father would forgive him, that the public might soften, that his children, Archie and Lilibet, could one day visit Buckingham Palace without tension. But now, with this one sweeping move, that future had evaporated. The door had not just closed, it had been sealed shut. Outside their estate, Montecito's mood had shifted. News crews arrived by late morning, parking their vans at a respectful distance, but still visible from the winding private roads that led to the Sussex residence. Drone cameras hovered, capturing glimpses of the perimeter. Neighbors, long accustomed to the presence of celebrities, were suddenly fielding calls from journalists and curiosity seekers. One neighbor was quoted saying, "I've never seen this many reporters here, not even when Oprah came over." A few miles down the road, a high-end cafe frequented by Meghan for casual meetings and wellness events was suddenly surrounded by paparazzi. A staff member confirmed she had a reservation scheduled for later that week. It was quietly canceled. At the local yoga studio, another frequent haunt of Meghan's, signs were posted requesting privacy and banning photography. But Montecito is not a place where scandal usually thrives. It's a town built on discretion. And now, its most famous residents were drowning in global spectacle once again. Internally, the Sussex PR team scrambled into overdrive. Phone lines burned as publicists contacted media outlets, trying to gather details and control the narrative. Initially, there was discussion about releasing a formal response, a measured but firm statement expressing disappointment and confusion over the decision. But the team was split. Some believed any reaction would look defensive and petty. Others warned that staying silent would allow the palace's move to dominate the narrative. By evening, Meghan reportedly overruled the indecision. There would be no official statement, not yet. But behind the scenes, she began reaching out to trusted media figures and friendly journalists, setting the stage for a future opportunity to reclaim the narrative. The silence, it seemed, was strategic, not submissive. Still, the optics were damaging. By day 2, headlines had grown crueler. Harry cut loose. Charles chooses Timothy over son. Meghan's grip on Sussex title slipping. Online discourse exploded into digital warfare. On one side, royal traditionalists celebrated the king's firm hand, praising his decision to uphold royal decorum. On the other, Sussex loyalists raged, accusing the monarchy of pettiness, racial bias, and betrayal. But the narrative wasn't easily controlled. Even within the Sussex camp, morale was cracking. According to a former staffer who had worked on the couple's charitable projects, there was growing concern that this would have ripple effects. Investors, collaborators, they all want certainty, the source said. When the monarchy strips someone of official credibility, it makes brands nervous. That's just the reality. And brands were paying attention. Emails from at least 2 global sponsors, one associated with wellness, the other with streaming content, reportedly requested clarification regarding Harry's status and future branding strategy. There were internal whispers at Netflix about re-evaluating the Sussex's content slate. No decisions were made publicly, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. What had once been a glamorous royal defection was now starting to look like a high-risk liability. Meghan, ever media-savvy, recognized this immediately. By day 3, she was already laying the groundwork for a reputational pivot. According to insider sources, she revived conversations with several American producers about a potential scripted drama project. The idea? A fictionalized, prestige television series that draws from, but doesn't directly mirror, her real-life royal journey. It would be her story without being her story. And more importantly, it would be hers to control. Harry, however, seemed less engaged. Friends said he had become withdrawn. Not in a depressive way, not exactly, but in a contemplative one. He began taking long walks on the estate, often alone. Spotted once by paparazzi near the cliffs at Butterfly Beach, his hood up, sunglasses on, walking with hands buried in his jacket pockets, he looked like a man out of place. As if Montecito, once their sanctuary, had become a gilded exile. Back in London, Palace sources insisted that the decision to remove Harry's titles was not personal. It was about preserving the institution. But that assertion rang hollow to many observers. After all, titles are more than honorary labels. They are symbols. They are history. And removing them from a blood prince, a son of the reigning monarch, was not an administrative move. It was a message. And that message hit Montecito like an earthquake. Even within Harry and Meghan's circle of American friends, opinions were divided. Some felt the king had gone too far, effectively abandoning his son. Others believed it was inevitable, a consequence of the couple's repeated rejection of royal protocol. But no one could deny the gravity of what had just occurred. A father had disowned his son, not with words, but with silence. Not with anger, but with action. Montecito, in the days that followed, became less a home and more a fortress. Security was increased. Staff movement was restricted. Deliveries were scrutinized. A sense of siege had set in. And perhaps most notably, the couple themselves had stopped appearing in public altogether. They were not spotted at local cafes. They skipped their weekly charity calls. Even their social media channels went quiet. It was the calm after a storm, but it felt less like peace and more like paralysis. Inside those walls, far from the gold-trimmed corridors of Buckingham Palace and the stately rituals of Balmoral, two people were reckoning with a new reality. For all their independence, all their ambition, they had just lost something that couldn't be rebuilt in California or rebranded on camera. They had lost the last thread tying them to the royal story. And in its place stood a void. One the world would rush to fill with opinions, speculation, judgment, and more than a little chaos. To the general public, Sir Timothy Lawrence was a name rarely spoken outside royal enthusiast circles. He had neither the fame nor the notoriety of Prince Harry, nor did he command the kind of media magnetism that follows heirs like Prince William. He wasn't in the tabloids, wasn't featured on podcast circuits, and had never, not once, sat down for a tell-all interview. And yet, in the wake of the king's decision to strip Harry of his remaining titles and bestow them upon Sir Timothy, the question that echoed across households, newsrooms, and palace walls was simple and bewildered. Why him? To understand that decision is to understand the monarchy's DNA. Not the glitz of coronations, the dazzle of crowns, or the fanfare of balcony waves, but the undercurrent of preservation, legacy, and survival. The crown, as an institution, is built on one foundational pillar, duty above all. And Sir Timothy Lawrence, though little known to the public, had quietly embodied that principle for over 4 decades. At first glance, his resume is impressive but not extraordinary. A distinguished vice admiral in the Royal Navy, knighted for his service, and a decorated veteran with a career spanning logistics, naval intelligence, and defense strategy. But it wasn't just his military achievements that caught the eye of King Charles. It was the way Sir Timothy moved through his world, without noise, without scandal, and without ego. Inside the royal family, few figures have managed to exist both within and outside the public eye as successfully as Timothy. Married to Princess, and since 1992, he had lived in the shadow of the most stoic and hard-working member of the royal family. Yet unlike other royal spouses, he never sought the limelight. He didn't brand himself. He didn't pitch memoirs. He wasn't photographed at charity galas unless it was in service to the crown. He was, in a very old-fashioned sense, what British aristocracy used to revere, a servant to the institution, not the other way around. By contrast, Prince Harry's trajectory had been marked by resistance. From his rebellious teen years to his explosive departure from royal duties, Harry's path was one of conflict with the very principles the monarchy held sacred. While his advocates applauded his willingness to speak truth to power, to stand beside his wife against media harassment, and to challenge outdated royal protocols, those inside the palace viewed his actions differently. They saw them not as progress, but as provocation. What King Charles needed in that moment, a moment defined by scandal fatigue, constitutional uncertainty, and global scrutiny, was not another charismatic leader. He needed stability. He needed someone who would not fuel headlines, but would quietly do the work. Someone who understood that the crown was not an accessory to personal narrative, but a lifelong burden carried in silence. And that someone was Sir Timothy. Privately, Charles had grown increasingly disillusioned with the way the Sussexes navigated post-royal life. From the interviews to the Netflix deals to the memoirs and monetized trauma, the couple's every move felt like a step away from the royal ethos Charles was determined to uphold. It wasn't about disagreements over ideology or politics. Charles himself had long pushed for modernization and reform within the monarchy. It was about tone, posture, the image of duty. In that context, Sir Timothy was not just a safe choice. He was a strategic one. He offered credibility without controversy. He was already trusted by the Queen during her lifetime, often seen in her inner circle during key ceremonial events. He had long-standing relationships with the military, especially the Royal Marines, a group Harry once held honorary command over. And he had the added advantage of being family, without the complicated emotional entanglements that made working with Harry increasingly untenable. According to palace insiders, Charles had privately discussed the idea of reassigning Harry's ceremonial duties for several months prior to the final decision. His initial hesitation wasn't out of sentimentality. Those who know him well say Charles has learned the hard way not to let personal emotions cloud institutional decisions, but out of timing. The Queen's passing, the coronation, and the political climate had all delayed what Charles believed was an inevitable necessity, transferring symbolic power from a prince who had abandoned his post to someone who could honor it. Timothy's appointment was, in many ways, symbolic retribution, not of vengeance, but of values. Where Harry had stepped out, Timothy had stepped in. Where Harry had spoken out, Timothy had remained silent. Where Harry had leveraged his royal past for commercial gain, Timothy had never profited from the crown in any way outside of his service-based honors. And that's what made him perfect. Still, the public reaction revealed just how polarizing the decision was. To royal traditionalists, Timothy's promotion was long overdue. "He's the very embodiment of duty," wrote one columnist for the Times. "Unflashy, principled, and loyal, everything the monarchy needs in this era of Instagram kings and podcast queens." To Sussex supporters, however, it felt like an unnecessary humiliation. "This was a power play," a prominent American talk show host said. It was Charles telling his son, "You are replaceable." And that's cold, even for royalty. But the real power of Timothy's appointment wasn't in the statement it made. It was in the message it sent. To those within the royal machine, it was reassurance. The crown still valued consistency. It still rewarded loyalty. There was still honor in being the person who quietly carried the weight without complaint. To the world outside, it was a clear line in the sand. The monarchy was not a media circus. It was not a platform. It was not a business. It was, in the mind of Charles, a sacred trust. And Sir Timothy, with his steady hands and soldier's heart, was the only one worthy of that trust when it mattered most. His first act after receiving the titles was telling. He didn't host a press conference. He didn't grant an interview. He didn't post on social media. Instead, he returned to his residence with Princess and resumed his duties with barely a word. When he did appear in public, weeks later at a veterans' hospital, he refused to speak about the appointment. The king asked, "I serve," was all he said. For many, that said it all. Timothy was never trying to be a replacement for Harry. He wasn't attempting to erase the prince's legacy or diminish his journey. But he was willing to carry what Harry had put down, and in doing so, restore a sense of gravity to roles that had been turned into headlines. The monarchy had long operated under the principle of the gray man. The individual who doesn't attract attention but quietly holds the center. Timothy, for all his obscurity, had become the gray man who now stood at the heart of the royal institution. His presence was a rebuke to fame-based royalty. His appointment was a nod to the old ways. And his silence spoke volumes. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Timothy's rise was how unshaken he appeared by it. No sense of triumph. No indication of hesitation. Just calm acceptance. The demeanor of a man who had spent his life being overlooked, now entrusted with the very titles that once belonged to a global icon. Whether the public embraces him or not, whether historians debate the fairness of the king's decision, one thing remains certain. Sir Timothy Lawrence represents a new chapter in the monarchy, one that prizes substance over spectacle and quiet strength over loud rebellion. And for King Charles, that may be the most revolutionary choice of all. When the news broke that Prince Harry had been officially stripped of all remaining royal titles, and more shockingly, that they were being handed to Sir Timothy Lawrence, Meghan Markle did not retreat. If the royal family expected her to take the hit quietly, to disappear into the background, while Sir Timothy stepped into Harry's former role, they had fundamentally miscalculated the woman they were dealing with. Inside their Montecito estate, where panic and silence had engulfed much of the household, Meghan reportedly sprang into action. To some insiders, it felt less like emotional devastation and more like the opening move in a chess match. One source familiar with the Sussex media operations described the mood as strategic anger, a precise, controlled fury that, once triggered, launched her into a storm of phone calls, planning, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. This wasn't just personal, it was business. And Meghan, despite the latest blow from Buckingham Palace, was not going to let the narrative be written without her pen. The first response came in silence, a non-response that carried weight. For 3 full days, no official statement was released. But Meghan's communications team was not idle. Carefully placed feelers were sent out to sympathetic journalists and media personalities, many of whom had defended her in the past. Quiet nods were given to producers with whom she had past relationships. These were not formal pitches, not yet, but the message was unmistakable. Meghan was preparing to speak. And when she did, it would not be in the form of an angry tweet or a hastily arranged press release. It would be strategic, cinematic, and calculated to do what she had done before: seize control of the cultural conversation. According to leaked emails from inside Archewell, the couple's philanthropic and media foundation, Meghan began exploring options for a new media campaign within hours of the title announcement. Not a reactive scandal damage control effort, but a full-blown narrative pivot. She reportedly instructed her team to turn this moment into a brand reclamation and to consider how to recenter the story around dignity, female strength, and surviving toxic institutions. This directive sparked a flurry of activity behind the scenes. Media strategists were brought in. Presentation decks were updated. Meghan's previous conversations with Netflix and Spotify executives were revisited. She had just received a public slap from the monarchy, but rather than retreating, she saw it as a moment to relaunch, on her own terms. One proposal that quickly gained momentum was a new docuseries concept, tentatively titled Reign Without a Crown. The premise was simple yet potent: a behind-the-scenes, emotionally raw exploration of Meghan's life post-royalty. It would blend diary-style interviews, documentary footage, and thematic segments highlighting issues of race, feminism, motherhood, and institutional trauma. The series would avoid directly referencing Buckingham Palace, at least legally, but anyone watching would know exactly what was being discussed. Multiple media outlets later confirmed that this pitch had been circulated among senior executives at least 2 major streaming platforms. A representative from one of those companies, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted the idea was bold and very risky, but also noted it had potential. It's the kind of project that either blows up or gets buried quietly. There's no middle ground. But Meghan wasn't only thinking about streaming. She reportedly reached out to former contacts in the publishing world, including editors who had expressed interest in a memoir of her own. The success of Harry's book, Spare, had proven the commercial viability of personal royal storytelling. Meghan's narrative, told from a woman's perspective, against the backdrop of gender and racial dynamics, would be even more layered. And she knew it. A ghostwriting team was tentatively assembled. Legal consultants were brought in to ensure that the book would avoid defamation suits while still delivering maximum impact. Potential titles were discussed in brainstorming meetings. One working title, leaked in early drafts, was Uncaged. Another, more pointed, was Duchess No More. Both emphasized the sense of liberation Meghan hoped to convey, not a woman broken by royal life, but one freed from it. Of course, the palace would not respond to any of this. Silence was their armor. But that silence, Meghan believed, was not a strength, it was a vulnerability. A vacuum she could fill with her own voice. Yet her strategy wasn't confined to media products. Meghan also began ramping up her philanthropic presence. Publicly, she had always been involved in women's rights and social justice causes. Now, those efforts took on sharper edges. She began re-engaging with global NGOs focused on maternal health, media ethics, and racial equity. Plans were reportedly drafted for a major keynote appearance at an international women's conference, one that would be live-streamed globally and framed around the theme of finding your voice when institutions silence you. The message was clear. Meghan wasn't going to fade away. She was going to reframe herself, not as a disgraced duchess, but as a leader, a survivor, a global voice for women who feel silent. There were even rumors of a new podcast series in development. While her original deal with Spotify had ended under less than ideal circumstances, sources say Meghan had already begun talks with alternative platforms, including Apple and Amazon's Audible division. The concept under discussion? A show built around interviews with women who had walked away from powerful men or institutions, queens without thrones, leaders without titles. Internally, her team called it the New Monarchy, a symbolic title suggesting that leadership could be defined outside the traditional pillars of crown and blood. It would be part culture, part activism, part memoir. And at its heart, it would be Meghan. But behind all this strategy was something deeper, something more emotional, more volatile. Meghan, for all her composure, was reportedly furious. Not just at the titles being stripped, but at the way it had been done. No phone call, no warning, no statement from the king. The decision had been delivered like a sentence, with Sir Timothy's name engraved on the tombstone of her husband's royal identity. And in Meghan's mind, that wasn't just a professional insult, it was personal warfare. She allegedly told a friend, "They're trying to erase us. They think if they give his title to someone else, people will forget who he is." That quote, though unconfirmed, reflects a very real fear inside the Sussex camp, that the monarchy wasn't just distancing itself, but actively rewriting the narrative to cast Harry and Meghan as irrelevant, petulant outcasts. In response, Meghan wasn't just strategizing. She was preparing to fight. Some within her circle urged caution. A few longtime advisors warned that another explosive media push could backfire, that public sympathy was finite, and the danger of being seen as combative was real. But others, especially her newer American consultants, urged her to move fast, while public attention was high and emotions raw. "Own the story before someone else does," one reportedly told her. That urgency was fueled further when British media outlets began publishing glowing profiles of Sir Timothy. The coverage painted him as a dignified veteran, a man of honor and discretion, the anti-Harry. For Meghan, this was a turning point. If they didn't act quickly, the comparison would become a fixture. Sir Timothy as the symbol of quiet loyalty, Harry as the face of rebellion and betrayal, and Meghan would be cast as the manipulative spouse who pulled the prince away. She knew how narratives worked. She had worked in Hollywood. She had spent years reading scripts. She had studied the press, studied headlines, learned how quickly reputations could be formed and destroyed. And she had no intention of becoming the villain in this next chapter. So the campaign accelerated. Meetings were held with stylists and image consultants. A new visual identity was discussed, less royal, more activist. Less formal, more modern. Photo shoots were quietly arranged. Magazine features were pitched. Not British tabloids, but American publications known for glossy, high-concept profiles. Vogue, The Cut, Vanity Fair. Behind each of these steps was the same guiding principle. Recast the story. Don't react to the monarchy's rejection, transcend it. Be bigger than royalty. Be more relatable than Sir Timothy. Be the woman who lost her title but gained her voice. By the end of the month, the first ripple effects of this strategy began surfacing. Meghan was photographed smiling with activists at a Los Angeles community center, wearing a simple white shirt with the words, "I choose my name." The photo went viral. Commentators dissected it endlessly. Was it a reference to her marriage? Her royal identity? A quiet jab at Buckingham Palace? She offered no explanation. That was the point. The revenge strategy wasn't rage. It wasn't retaliation. It was reinvention. And if Meghan had her way, the next time people heard her name, they wouldn't think about the title that was taken. They'd think about the empire she built in its place. But the question that hung in the air, around the palace gates, inside Sussex's PR meetings, and across social media, was this: would it work? Could one woman outmaneuver a 1,000-year-old institution? Could brand beat bloodline? Meghan believed so, and she was ready to prove it.